I definitely think developmental or substantive editing, it is much more collaborative because you're kind of bouncing back ideas. You're like, okay, hey, have you ever thought of this? Or have you ever thought why your character is doing this? Because they have to have this reason. They can't just be, floating around. And so when I do developmental edits, I always include some one-on-one time. Let's brainstorm. Let's talk about the edit. Let's figure out what this character is doing, what your story is trying to do. And that's one of my favorite parts of the edit, actually, is talking about the story.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 124 of the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In this episode, I have a chat with Lindsay Flanagan, who's a freelance writer and editor. After earning a Master of Arts in English and Creative Writing, she left her career of over a decade to pursue her dream job in the publishing world. She joined the Eschler Editing team in 2014 as an editor and project manager. She also edits for Immortal Works and Champagne Book Group. I've had the distinct pleasure of having Lindsay edit one of my stories, and I met her in person for the first time at the 2020 Superstars Writing Seminars in Colorado Springs a couple of months ago. And I'm thrilled to interview her for this episode, and that'll be coming up shortly. First, given that I have an audience and I feel that information and knowledge is critically important, I'd like to share a few words about the current COVID-19 coronavirus from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This is a short 1.5 minute clip from Dr. Tom Chiller with 6 steps to prevent COVID-19.
The virus that causes coronavirus disease is spreading in some of our communities. This disease, also known as COVID-19, is thought to spread mainly from person to person through respiratory droplets produced when an infected person coughs or sneezes. These droplets can spread to the mouth, nose, or hands of people who are nearby, or possibly be inhaled into the lungs. Take steps to lower your risk of getting sick. Here are some things you should do. Wash your hands often with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. You can also use hand sanitizer that contains at least 60% alcohol. Take extra measures to put distance between yourself and others. Avoid close contact with people who are sick. Stay home if you're sick, except to get medical care. If you have severe symptoms, please call 911. Cover coughs and sneezes with a tissue or the inside of your elbow. Only wear a face mask if you're sick and around other people, or if you need to take care of someone who is sick. Clean and disinfect frequently touched surfaces. Older adults and people who have severe chronic medical conditions like heart or lung disease or diabetes are at higher risk for more serious illness from COVID-19. This group should consult with their healthcare provider about additional steps to stay protected. For more information on COVID-19, please visit cdc.gov/COVID-19. Let's work together to protect ourselves, our families, and our communities.
One of the best short bits of advice I've recently seen regarding how to prevent the spread of this disease is this: don't behave like you're afraid of catching the virus. Behave like you're afraid of transmitting the virus. That being said, here's sending you and yours a virtual and social distance style safe virtual hug or high five, whatever you prefer. And now, some comments from recent episodes. This is from episode 122. Maddie Dalrymple said, I was listening to your personal update, including the status of the Amazing Monster Tales anthology series, and proceeding to your update on A Canadian Werewolf in New York. With monsters in mind, I thought you were writing a story involving Michael and Gail's Meat Cube, Meatcube, cube story until I realized with relief that you had said meet cute, although some of your followers may prefer the meet cube premise. Wonderful show as always. Thanks so much, Maddie. That really made me laugh. Meet cube makes me actually think I should write a meet cube story somewhere in the short horror tales that I'm writing. But interesting that you talk about that meet cute, because a lot of the other comments I'm about to share are kind of related. They tie back to me and that writing that meet cute. Now, some of the other comments come from patrons. Maddie is a patron, of course, but I would like to welcome new patron to the show, Katie. Katie, thank you for joining the small but powerful group of patrons who support this podcast over on patreon.com/starkreflections. And speaking of patrons, I've recently pushed 2 special patron-only audio feeds out through the Patreon site. They are the short story collection Snowman Shivers. I figured, given that it was springtime, I wanted to provide that available to you for free, some audio listening. And the story, That Old Silk Hat They Found, is appropriate for children. I've actually gone in to read it at schools. And just this morning, I'm recording this on March 19th, 2020, I've posted the opening of a sneak peek at my audiobook version of An Author's Guide to Working with Libraries and Bookstores. Now, that is a process that I'm in the throes of right now, and I've spent probably 4 hours so far working on it, and I've only got about an hour and a half of audio actually produced and ready to go. So it's probably going to be another 10 hours of work before I end up with the 4 to 5 hour audiobook that it will be at the end. But the patrons, you guys are awesome, and you get a chance for a sneak peek at that well before the audiobook is available for people to purchase. If you are a patron, make sure to check out the special audio feed and that should push automatically directly to your podcatcher. And if you need help with that, let me know. Either message me on Patreon or email me via mark@markleslie.ca, and I can get you sorted with that. Now, speaking of messages, there are 2 comments on the special Patreon episode where I did a reflection on Becca Syme's Question the Premise episode 1.06 on procrastination. Sherry Dector-Hurst said, "Great podcast on procrastination. I'm also a big fan of Becca's. This year I'm writing a short story for an anthology that's way outside my genre, but utilizes the research I've compiled through 8 books in 2 series. I've been flummoxed about how to get into the story. I've never written a short story, and all my ideas are too complex. As well, I've had to get a handle on the usual tropes in an unfamiliar genre. To help with the process, I've been watching a lot of applicable movies and thinking, and feeling very guilty about not writing. So this outlook on procrastination was very timely. As an aside, I'm going to use it as a 1-year anniversary gift for newsletter subscribers. Keep up the good work, Mark." Signed, Sherry. Thanks for sharing that, Sherry, and for the comment. Wishing you the best of luck with it. And I love that you shared how listening to that episode from Becca was useful to you as you were going through the process of learning something new. That's something that we all experience, and it's very appropriate to some of the comments I'm about to share as well about me learning something new, going back to that meat cube that I'm writing. Kathy Mack also left a comment on that episode. And she said, "Mark, thanks for the most recent Patreon postings. Like you, I plan on responding to almost every post, but I rarely remember to do so when I'm at my keyboard. So in answer to your question from many posts ago, Kathy Mack is my pen name, but WordPress said that it was taken, so I went to Katie, K8TY Mack, which is also a nickname. Call me by either. I'm not fussy. Just don't call me late for dinner." I won't do that, Katie or Kathy. I'm just going to stick with calling you Kathy probably, but I am glad that I got your name right. Kathy also shared a great 4-minute animated video on how the internet affects our brains, showing how important it is to stare into space. Thanks, Kathy, and I'm going to reshare that link on the show notes for this episode over at starkreflections.ca so you listeners can check it out too. Kathy also says, "And I don't believe that you procrastinate. Try listing everything you've done in, say, the most recent week. A person has to chill out and to enjoy life, to turn off sympathetic nervous responses and mellow into the parasympathetic ones. However, she said, putting her teacher hat on, all unasked, I have noticed that you've been talking about, and not writing, that werewolf meetup story for a long time. I have one suggestion and one offer. Number 1, stop talking about it. Talking about a story before it's written can make the writing much harder. 2, maybe you're stopped because you don't know enough yet, in which case may I offer myself as a monster, subset werewolf resource person? I can talk with you about the cultural significance of monster, a la Cohen's Monster Culture 7 thesis, of which the first is the monster's body is a cultural body. About the werewolf as sacred exclusion, the other who's ostracized defines a culture. And if Michael is trying to start a relationship, he doesn't accept what it means to be a monster, a la Agamben's Homo Caesar. And I would love to talk with you about Marie de France's 14th century werewolf story, Les La Fresne. I hope I pronounced that right, in which the wife is the ultimate monster who betrays her husband because he is a werewolf. We're all a bit more pinned down by the COVID-19 thing than anyone expected even a week ago. Maybe we should see this as a chance to talk monsters and werewolves. Well, thank you so much for that, Kathy. I appreciate your perspective on the self-criticism and procrastination as well. I appreciate you putting that teacher hat on and the advice on just getting my butt into the chair and writing the story. I'm also very, very fascinated by your werewolf monster resource person details. Wow, there's so much to dig into there. I'd love to actually have you come on a future episode to chat with me about this. Yes, I would love to chat with you about it offline, but since I'll be learning so much, if you're up to it, I'd love to do that learning out in the open and see if listeners to this podcast could also benefit from the things you share and how that will likely help me, because I'm all about showing behind the curtains and how some of these things work for writers. And speaking of comments about advice about me writing that When Michael Met Gail story, I received an email from Lynn Worthen that said, Hi Mark, just listening to your most recent podcast where you were talking about writing the meet cute for your werewolves and grappling with the story structure. I wanted to recommend the book that helped me enormously with writing the romance stories that I submitted for the recent anthology workshop. I think you may find it extremely helpful to you as well. Lynn recommended the book Romancing the Beat, Story Structure for Romance Novels by Gwen Hayes. I immediately bought the audiobook on Kobo, and since it's only about an hour long, I managed to listen to it that same day on my drive between Hamilton and Waterloo. It was a fantastic book and extremely helpful. I've thought a lot about some of the things she said, and I know I'll be listening to it again on one of my regular runs. Lynn also sent me an example of having filled out the beat sheet, which is one of the free online resources you get from the book. And Lynn explained how she used them and offered this fantastic advice. Don't overthink it. Fill in enough to guide you as you're writing without stressing yourself out about the structure. The main goal is to move the characters logically and naturally through the beats, maintaining the pacing you've established for your story and keeping the emotional level high, and remembering that whatever outside conflicts you've introduced, the couple must also deal with their own doubts, fears, and desires if the relationship is going to feel authentic to the readers. Thank you, Lynn. I love how amazingly supportive and helpful my reflective listeners to this podcast are. Thank you guys so much. I know it's been helpful to me as a writer, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be helpful to other listeners out there as well. And a bit of an update. About a week ago, I actually wrote the opening 500 or so words to the story where Michael, my Canadian werewolf, and Gail meet. I had to ensure it matched the brief overview that Michael mentions about how they met and got together in the novel A Canadian Werewolf in New York. And of course, after listening to the Gwen Hayes book and reflecting on it, I'm wondering if I need to consider writing the story from both Michael and Gail's perception. And also based on a conversation I had with my friend Julie Strauss, who's a romance writer, about the story, how to create the proper try-fail in the relationship for that initial meeting and getting together story makes me think that it may be interesting to see that from Gail's perspective as well. Now, this entire process is lots of fun for me as I'm learning to write in a genre that I'm not familiar with. Now, my deadline to get the story into the editors is April 17, 2020, so I'll likely sometime the last week of March or the first week of April be butt in chair and making it happen, using some of the resources from Gwen Hayes, hopefully from some information I get from Katie, as well as chatting with other friends like Julie about the process, and I'll keep you guys posted. Now, there are more comments, but I'll get to them in next week's episode. Just a reminder to listeners that you still have a chance by commenting on episode 123, the interview with Thorn and Zach Bohannon on their new book, 3-Story Method, for a chance to win a print copy of the book and the workbook. Go leave a way or a hack for writers, and this is in honor of Jay's Ways and Zach's Hacks from their own Career Author podcast. Now leave that in comments for episode 123 at starkreflections.ca, and you have until the end of March 2020 to leave a comment for your chance to win. Now, let's hear a brief word from this episode's sponsor, Findaway Voices. Findaway Voices recently announced that you're now able to add keywords to your audiobooks. Keywords help listeners find your audiobooks in searches. This new metadata field is an optional but effective way to increase your visibility for your work on some of the retailers. Use keywords to provide more context about your audiobook that doesn't fit in the rest of your metadata. Useful information such as the tone, setting, or legitimate spelling variations are all great elements to add. Add your keywords in the additional metadata section of your project's metadata page. Add them one at a time, hitting the add button between each keyword. There is a character limit for keywords, so start by entering the most important ones first. And that tip is excellent advice for entering keywords on any platform, whether it's an audiobook or an ebook. Always enter the most important keywords first. Now, if you're looking for how you can use Findaway Voices to get your audiobook into more than 40 retail and library channels, go ahead and check them out over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. Well, that's it for the introductory matter to this podcast. Let's get into this conversation with Lindsay Flanagan. Lindsay, thank you so much for hanging out with me today.
Yes, thanks for having me, Mark.
So I want to start off by going into your background and when writing and editing became a passion for you. How did it all start?
Oh, that's a novel in and of itself. I mean, basically, I think I'm like a lot of other writers where I loved writing my whole life. I was really into teenage angst poetry. But I got my bachelor's degree in English and literature. But at the time, my husband was deployed to Afghanistan and I needed a full-time job. And I was a work-study student at the university. And they were like, hey, we want to hire you full-time in the Financial Aid and Scholarships office. So I was like, okay, sure, buy some time. 11 years later, and after becoming the associate director of the Financial Aid and Scholarships office, I liked it, but like you said, that writing and editing was my passion. And I'd had my second child, and I just thought, you know what, it's time. So I left a really good career, and I was doing my graduate degree program, and I just said bye, and I'm going to pursue this. So
wow, wait, I mean, leaving a college, I mean, it's you usually get a good benefits package, good salary to work at a college, and then you went into freelance editing, which is kind of always up in the air, no guarantees. That's bravery. What were some of the deciding factors then?
Well, we have two daughters, and they were going to daycare, and I really wanted to be more involved with them. I mean, because I was just getting nights and weekends with them, and my husband is an airline pilot, and I supported him those 11 years while I was going to flight school. So we really just had this kind of moment where we're like, you know what, let's flip. Let's let him be the breadwinner and you pursue that thing you absolutely love. So, and I know a lot of people don't have that benefit of having like a partner or a best friend to just be like, hey, yeah, let's do it. So really lucky, really blessed, but I also paid my dues for 11 years.
Of course. So was it freelance editing that was your passion, that you wanted to edit, you wanted to work on stuff like that?
I think I kind of learned that later because I met Angela Eschler of Eschler Editing, who I freelance for. it was a few years before I actually, jumped the career ship.
Right.
And she impressed me so much. She was so knowledgeable and so professional. And she just said, "Hey, here's my card. If you ever need anything, let me know." So, 3 years later, when I'm in graduate school, I reached out to her and I said, "Yeah, I need an internship." She said, "Great, let's do this." So that's and then I started learning from her, like what developmental editing is. And, I like line editing as well, which is prose, because I was, teenage angst poet, but I think sometimes I'm still a poet at heart. But copy editing, take it or leave it. I'm not excited about grammar. And I think I am. You can't be an editor and not be excited about
Of course.
when I have to choose, I want to get into story and I want to get into language. And that's why I was a writer. And when I started learning that from Angela, I just fell in love with it. I was like, hey, I can be a writer and I can also help other writers.
Oh,
So
that's fantastic.
So that's kind of where I started. And then Angela trained me for about 6 months. And then she said, "Hey, do you want to be one of my administrative assistants?" I was like, "Oh, sure, why not? Be more involved in the business." And then now I'm one of her project managers as well as editors. So.
Oh, wow. So you're juggling many, many hats. So the question I have to ask is, with all of these things that you're doing, are you still finding time to write, or has the editor taken over? Where's that teenage poet?
She's still in there. I try to, I actually just try to write on Sundays, because that's the one day that I can just write and my kids are playing or whatever. And sometimes in the evenings, if I've got a moment, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to write a few lines. So it's still there. It's still a passion. I have a manuscript I've sent out to agents. So, and I'm doing another internship too, because, I have to work. I have to be busy with
Another internship. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So where do I have all my time? I don't know.
Now you'd mentioned, I want to go back to this because you'd mentioned developmental editing, copy editing, line editing, etc. For listeners who aren't familiar and they just think editing is proofreading, can you just give a high level overview of what the different styles are, especially the ones that you've been involved in?
Yeah, so developmental, which I've also heard as content editing, but at Eschler, we actually call it substantive editing. That's where we're going in and we're looking at your story. We're looking at plot and structure and characterization, dialogue, all the things that make a story work. We're making sure it actually works. And then line editing is more prose. It's the language, sentence structure, the way you're choosing to tell the story, really where your style and voice come out. And then copy editing is grammar. It's punctuation and it's spelling and making things really clean. So, and then proofreading is actually something different, at least with Eschler. We have like a quick proofread, but then when you take it to press, because we do self-publishing at Eschler, we have a galley proofread where you're actually looking at the book design and making sure that, there are no widows or orphans or word stacks, things like that.
Okay, cool. And what's I suspect developmental editing, substantive editing is your cup of tea?
Yes, I love it.
And that's where I first met you. I was involved in an anthology project where Eschler Editing had taken on the editing of this collection of stories. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate enough to get assigned this wonderful editor who took a story that I had submitted, and the fascinating thing that I have to explain is this is a story that was a reprint, so it had been edited and published twice already, and then the third time that it was going to be reprinted was included in this anthology. And as a developmental editor, you asked probing questions that actually made this story even better than ever before, which is kind of like, wait a second, it's already been through two batches of editors. It had never been through a substantive or developmental edit, though. So to me, maybe that's an illustration of the value that a writer can get from working in that collaborative way with an editor, I think, which it feels more collaborative, doesn't it?
Yeah, I definitely think developmental or substantive editing, it is much more collaborative because you're kind of bouncing back ideas. You're like, okay, hey, have you ever thought of this? Or have you ever thought why your character is doing this? Because they have to have this reason. They can't just be, floating around. And so when I do developmental edits, I always, well, at Eschler and when I do my own freelancing, I always include some one-on-one time. Let's brainstorm. Let's talk about the edit. Let's figure out what this character is doing, what your story is trying to do. And that's one of my favorite parts of the edit, actually, is talking about the story.
What? So you get on the phone, or you do like a Skype or Zoom chat or something like that with the client, and you just chat about the story?
They'll ask questions. They'll say, okay, you didn't understand what was going on here. Here's what I was trying to do. So then we'll talk about how to make that come across
Oh, wow.
in a better way. So, yeah.
That's interesting. So you're actually having a discussion after you've handed them back your notes?
Yeah. And I think that I read on Joshua Esso's website the other day, I read that his developmental edits are like taking a writing course. And that's one of I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's a fantastic description, because
Right.
I'll read your stuff, but then we're going to talk about how you're going to make it better, how you're going to write, how you're going to make a sequence of events actually be a story.
Okay, that's fantastic. So as an editor, what are the things that you're looking for in a writer client that you're interested in working with?
Um, I think that you need to find somebody who reads widely in your genre or has studied a lot of different genres.
Right.
So like I wouldn't be the best editor for like a thriller because that's not really my genre.
Right.
But I do love short stories and I love ghost stories, as you know, because we worked on that together.
Yeah.
I love fantasy. I love young adult, middle grade. I like romance, But I think, and I think that I would turn away some things that are like, it's just not my cup of tea, So let's help you find an editor who's really well versed at this. So like at Eschler, we have a whole bunch of different editors who specialize in different things. So if I see a project come across, I know our editors well enough that I'm like, hey, this would be a really good project for you.
Oh, wow. Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, because you want to match up with someone who's super excited about your story, super excited
Right.
about the genre, and who can get in there.
So it almost feels to me then like through Eschler Editing, I had you edit my ghost story.
Uh-huh.
But even though I enjoyed working with you, if I go, oh, I want to work with Eschler Editing again, but this is a thriller, you may punt that over to an editor who's more passionate about thrillers, because it's
Right.
probably going to be a better experience for both writer and editor, I guess. Is that how that works?
Yeah, I think that if you're like just not into the story, you're not going to edit it well, and then that doesn't really benefit the writer. I mean, I could talk about story structure and characterization and I could help that way. But if you really want to get someone who knows like the genre conventions and like what's being done in the genre right now, since I don't read it, I think somebody else would be a better fit.
Okay. So do you work with clients before they, I guess there's two main paths a writer can take. They can self-publish, or
Mhm.
they can submit it to a traditional market. Now, are you finding yourself working with clients who are getting their work edited before they submit it to a publisher, as well as clients who are getting it edited before they self-publish it?
Yeah, both. So with Eschler, a lot of our clients are coming to us. Well, they're coming to us from everywhere and doing everything. So
Okay.
we get a lot of fiction clients who are getting ready to submit to agents and publishers, trying to make
Okay.
sure they're putting their best work out there before they submit.
Right.
And then a lot of our nonfiction clients are actually self-publishing. So we're getting both routes. And not to say that, we don't have some nonfiction that are going to traditionally publish or some fiction that are just going to go ahead and self-publish. We get a good mix, but the bulk of it, fiction, I think, is looking for traditional publishing. So,
Okay.
but aside from Eschler, I do edit for a couple publishers too. So I'm in both arenas. So.
Oh, so publishers actually, as a freelancer, publishers hire you for probably specific projects that they know are in your forte, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. What is roughly, so for writers looking to budget an editor, what are they looking at roughly, let's say, for let's say it's an 80,000 word novel, what should they? And I guess there's going to be different ranges for different types of editing, is it most likely?
Yeah, we have different rates because it's a different thing. It's a different process. 80,000 words, developmental edit, I'd have to like get out my calculator and do some math.
Right. Okay.
Um, but do you want me to do that real quick?
Yeah, you could go ahead and do the math. I'll do some verbal juggling here while we're waiting for the math to come up. I mean, I was going to ask you all kinds of things. What about a 5,000 word short story? What about...
You know what? So here's the thing, because I hate giving numbers. I mean, I'm not a math person at all. But
You and me both.
yeah. But one of the things that I tell clients is that your manuscript is so unique that your editorial bid is going to be super unique too, because
Okay.
this person's 80,000 word manuscript might be really, really messy, like a really messy house that needs a deep cleaning.
Oh, okay.
But this person's 80,000 word manuscript may have gone through a ton of beta reads, a ton of revisions, and it only needs like a light cleaning. So it can be very different. But out on our website, we say that like substantive editing can be anywhere between 300 and 2,000 and maybe even more depending on unique manuscript needs.
Oh, okay.
But kind of go into it knowing you're going to spend a good amount of money, but you're also going to then expect more than just a couple commas.
Right. Okay.
I had a writing partner who, before he met me, now he knows better, but that I paid $500 to an editor who fixed 2 commas. And I was like, oh my gosh, you can't do that. So don't do that.
Okay.
Don't pay $500 for 2 commas to be fixed, especially if you're going in.
It's like $250 a comma.
It's true. That's true. So know the type of edit you're going for, because if you get it back with no commas fixed and they're talking about your story structure, that's what you've paid for.
So from an editor's standpoint, sometimes the editor needs to see the full manuscript or at least a good sample to understand what they're getting into. For example, you bring your car to the shop, it's a new car, it's in really good shape. A tune-up is going to be very minimal.
Right.
Someone else brings in an old jalopy that's not roadworthy. And you're like, no, this is going to take a bit more work. Is it that sort of thing? You look at it and you're like, well, based on what you have here, here's what I can do for you. And that's usually where the estimate comes from.
Yes, exactly. That's a great metaphor.
Yeah, I thought that applicable. So I guess from the other perspective, when a writer's looking to figure out if an editor is a good fit, what is it? Is it typically a page? Do you submit like 300 words, 500 words? And is there an opportunity to say, well, I want to see what you can do for me? I want to see, like, how does that relationship unfold?
Yeah, great question. Always get a sample edit, because you want to make sure that your editor understands your message or your story, what you're trying to do. And you want to make sure you mesh, that you guys can get along, and, because you're going to be working with them for several weeks or months, and you want to make sure that they're as in love with your story and passionate about it as you are. So we definitely offer sample edits, and I will usually do 2 to 3 pages, and then kind of give an overall view, like, hey, of course I haven't read your full story, but this is kind of what I'm getting from it right here. Here's what I think needs to happen. Here's how I'll fix it. And then we go from there. And if the client likes it, they're like, yeah, or they might ask you a few questions about the sample. So those are the things you want to look for.
All right, cool. So what is the importance? Because we live in a DIY society where you can go on YouTube and learn how to do anything, fix this, or, your jalopy, for example, I'm going to do the oil change myself, or I'm going to do whatever, change the brakes. Why is it important in a society where we have so much ability to do things ourselves? Why is a professional edit so important?
Well, I think that, beta readers have their value, but a lot of time, your beta readers are like your family or your friends, and they don't want to hurt your feelings.
Okay.
Because, I think that where that metaphor might break with the car is that this is kind of your heart and soul that you've poured out into a story. And to receive criticism can be very personal. So your friends and family are be like, yeah, it's great. Or if you go to like a writing group, which are also really valuable, you might get feedback from somebody who, for example, does not read thrillers. And they're like, yeah, this isn't working for me. I don't really like it. I don't get it. And you're like, oh, great. My writing's crap. I quit. But you might have a writing partner who really loves thrillers and they're really loving it. But then you have to think, well, I need an objective and professional view of it then. Will this work in today's market? Because your thriller writing partner might be like, yeah, I love it. It's totally my style, but is it going to work in the market? And that's where a professional editor comes in. We're working in the industry. We're going to, conferences like Superstars. We're learning what agents and editors and publishers and even readers today are looking for, And we also have industry training with story structure, which surprisingly, I don't know, you tell me if this is surprising, but a lot of writers don't really know what story structure is.
Even though it seems organic, right? It seems like we know story structure because we've heard stories from when we were little.
Right.
It should be obvious, shouldn't it?
It should be. But it's not. And even I put on my writer hat and I'm like, well, why doesn't my story work? I'm like, oh, because it's just not working because I'm missing key elements to make it work.
And so it's not just a second set of eyes, but it's a second set of eyes that understand the market, understand the genres you're writing in, and maybe even understand some of the trends that are going on in the industry as well. And can that be, so when you're doing developmental editing, are there opportunities where something that you say, well, actually 10 years ago that would have worked, but you can't say this now, or like, do you get into stuff like that with a writer as well?
Yeah, because I'm really big into fantasy. I see a lot of people trying to redo Tolkien, and it's like Tolkien wrote almost 100 years ago, and yes, it's absolutely still viable today because of especially like with the films like Peter Jackson, and I'm a huge Peter Jackson fan, so I don't know, some of the Tolkien purists out there are gonna like shut off the podcast right now, but I think what he did was take an old story and put a modern lens over it to make it appealing to today's world. So that's kind of what I have to explain to some of my fantasy writers is, well, this has already been done. How can you make it more appealing to today's market? And you can't walk around Middle Earth for 700 chapters because nobody has the patience or the time for that these days. Okay. But they will read Tolkien for that because he's the father of modern fantasy.
Okay, so that's a perfect example of a book or series of books that still sell like crazy today, but you might not be able to get away with writing a new version in that same manner.
Yeah, I think that, like J.K. Rowling is a really good example too. Like she burst onto the scene like 23, 25 years ago. Yeah. She did something new with fantasy. So you probably can't write a story about a boy wizard.
No, probably not. Unless you do something unique.
True.
The familiar with just a little bit of a twist. What are some of the other mistakes that you see writers commonly making?
Oh, wow. Just one?
Okay. Well, we cap it at 3.
I think that one of the ones I see, and I can pick on female writers too, but right now I'm going to pick on male writers. They want to try to write women because a lot of people are thirsty for female protagonists. And I'm not saying men can't write female protagonists. They just forget to get a female perspective. Right. So that's where like female beta readers and female editors would really be helpful to make sure you're making that voice authentic. Because otherwise you're just a man trying to write a girl, and I can say the opposite too. Like if I were to write a male point of view, which actually I am, I'm going to send it to a lot of guys and be like, hey, am I representing this guy well? Is this really how he would act? It's
almost like there's an appropriation thing going on. It's like, oh, I'm just going to make some assumptions based on what I think is your perspective. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, what are some of the other errors that you're seeing that are common?
I think that one thing is that writers think that things matter in the story. So they write this really beautiful description of something and they're so in love with it. And you're like, yes, as a standalone, it's gorgeous. It's a great writing exercise. But what is it doing to move your plot forward? And they're like, well, it's there. They're like, yeah, it's just there. We got to cut this whole thing. It's slowing down your pacing. And that's hard. That's really hard. I'm sure plenty of writers have heard the kill your darlings. And some of those things have to be cut because it's not helping your story move forward at all. It's not helping your character grow at all. It's just kind of there because you love it.
Because it's just beautiful writing, and boy, did I ever describe him opening that door and walking in the room so brilliantly. I took 4 pages to do it, and it was really well written.
Yeah. And it probably is, but it's not helping your story.
Yeah, that's right, because the moving forward was really, really, really slow. I mean, I think of someone like Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, like the opening setting is just magnificent. It was like the first novel of the 20th century, but I don't think you can get away with that sort of gigantic scene building for such a short novel, right?
Right.
Today. So Eschler Editing has some free resources available for writers. I'd love for you to share some of those so people can say, hey, where can I can go download some of these things.
Yeah, so if you go to our website, which is eschlerediting.com, we've got a few different free resources on there. We have a steps to publishing, and we also have a free proofreading checklist, which is super helpful. And I know I've like harped on story structure, and that's really important, but I'll just say something about our proofreading checklist.
Yeah.
It's super helpful to use just that do it yourself, just to make sure that you're getting your there, and there, and your hour and hour, because if you submit it to a publisher and they can't read it because it's, bad grammar or, it's not punctuated correctly, they're going to be like, this author hasn't taken the time to really make this clean and make this professional. So proofreading checklist, super awesome.
It sounds like that tool alone could actually help save you money when you're hiring a freelance editor, because if the manuscript is that much cleaner, they're not looking at an old jalopy. They're looking at something that's already running a little bit more smoothly. So taking that investment up front could probably save them time, right?
Right. That's a really good point there. So before you go to a professional editor, definitely get your hands on all these free resources and go to writing conferences so you learn how to write, so that when your editor comes to your book, they're not like, well, let's talk about story structure. You already know what it is.
Yeah, let's talk about sentence structure.
Right. Right. Word of warning on sentence structure and grammar and things like that. Yes, you can hire your best friend who has a bachelor's degree in English, but do they have industry training on Chicago manual style? That's something to look into as well. So, but yeah, go to our website. We have proofreading checklist. We also have a character checklist, and I'm going to get you that link later.
Character is in like people in your story, not in like characters like numbers and letters.
Right.
Okay. Right. Oh, that's awesome. So those will be links that'll be added into the show notes at starkreflections.ca for this episode. Where else can people find out about you and about Eschler Editing online?
So our website has most of the information, but we do post things on our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook, find Eschler Editing. And then we are on Twitter, just at Eschler Editing. And then me personally, I'm on, I'll send you my website but I'm at Lindsay Flanagan on Twitter. And I try to be pretty involved on there. So
pretty active in the Twitter sphere. Excellent.
Yeah. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm doing an internship with a literary agency. So I'm trying to share a lot of industry and agency stuff too. So
excellent. So one final question is, what is one thing that you would have told your younger self before you got into this writing and editing business that would have been a valuable thing for you to understand now that you've had so much experience?
Wow. I think that something that I've learned is that every writer who comes to me, they have a really good idea. Even I had really good ideas, but when I read my manuscripts from 10 years ago, I cringe. I'm like, oh my gosh, why did I think I could put elves in my story? I think that every writer brings something new, and it's just drawing out that new, unique, marketable concept that is kind of that make or break deal, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
You need to understand today's industry and what's going on in the industry. You may have written a really beautiful book, but it might not be selling or might not be being accepted because it's not what's going on in the industry right now.
Excellent. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Of course.
I wanted to reflect on something that Lindsay said, and I think it applies in multiple layers for the way that a writer thinks about the strategies that they're using in their writing career. Now, she talked about the importance of matching an editor that you hire with that editor's preferred genre or the core genre or the genre that they're most intimately familiar with or passionate about. And that's almost no different than when you're thinking about your ideal reader or your target audience. You're thinking about the book being something that's ideal for them. Now, with the editor, it's obvious that a writer that's invested in a genre, familiar with the ins and outs of the tropes of the genre, is probably going to be better for you to develop that piece of writing ideally for that target audience. But again, I love that parallel between thinking about the editor you're going to work with and thinking about the audience, because the intended reader of the fiction is the most important thing you can think about when you're a writer. And I work with a lot of clients who are looking for marketing support, and 9 times out of 10, I have to go back to their initial RFP or the brief that they put out in their request and make sure that they are 100% clear that they are targeting the right reading audience. Because if you spend any money on an editor, you spend any money on marketing, and that editor or that target audience is not exactly what is lined up for your piece of writing, you're wasting a lot of money. You're wasting money on hiring the wrong editor. It could be an amazing editor that does literary fiction brilliantly but has no clue about epic fantasy. Well, they may be good in terms of particular things like character development, etc., maybe high-level plot arcs and things like that. But they may not be as invested in it as an editor who is intimately familiar with the epic fantasy genre. So thinking about those things is really, really important. And again, it's not just thinking about them when you're ready to market the book. It's thinking about that when you are preparing your manuscript. Wanted to remind you there's free resources available that Lindsay mentions at eschlerediting.com. There will be links to those things that Lindsay mentioned, those resources, in the show notes at starkreflections.ca. Well, that's it for the reflection for this episode. This was episode 124 of the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. If you enjoy the Stark Reflections podcast, the best thing you can do to help me is either leave a review for the podcast on the podcatcher of your choice, or better yet, share it with a friend that you think would find value from the content. So, until next week and episode 125, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.